such a wonderful help to me. You were encouraging to me at first. But then you got rabidly excited about it. And talk about Ordung. It started just marching me right along. And I read, must be close to a dozen books on World War I U-boats and several large tomes on the First World War and any other thing that he could line up for me and I could line up for myself. So he's still at it. We just got a book delivered today, and I was forced to look at that before we came. So I'm hoping I'm ready for most everything. And so thank you, Adrian. And I want to thank his friend and my friend too, Aaron Willett. Aaron did the design and the layout of the book, and everywhere I take that book, I get it in there because the first thing, I don't say anything, my father's story, just chopped liver. They look at it and say, man, nice layout. So I am so grateful to have her to do that, and thank you, Aaron. I really appreciate it. You're awfully patient too, and endlessly changing my mind about things. The evil, cheap program I had for editing, had trouble with it, but anyway, we managed. So, what I would like to do now, maybe we could just have this set up, on the thing. And I'm going to read a few excerpts from the book. Normally I would stand, but as the weather gets nicer, my arthritis doesn't like it even more. So I think maybe, I know you're getting scared because I think, God, how much is she going to read? I'm just going to sit. So they say it's always better to sit down before you fall down, so I'm going to try to take that to heart myself. So anyway, I thought perhaps the book is divided into sort of two parts. The first part is sort of the German part, when he was August Svengauer, and it includes his wartime service. And then the second part is his life in Canada when he was Carl Huss, because it's otherwise a constant thing of going back and forth. So I tried to separate to a degree. So I'm going to start in the first part and talk a little bit about the chapter called Wartime Service. So during my father's school years, clouds of war were already gathering over Europe and Germany. Vicious right-wing propaganda spread over-the-top patriotism, love for the fatherland, and hatred of the enemies everywhere. My dad, however, wasn't much affected and didn't want to go to war. When war broke out in 1914, it was Germany and Austria against the English, French, and Russian empires. He chose to do farming as part of an auxiliary service so he could avoid signing up. But in 1917, conscription was enforced. Court and trial records show he joined the Navy, the Kaiserliche Marine, or Imperial German Navy 2nd Division in Wilhelmshaven in October at the age of 18. He transferred to the Submarine Corps December 1st, 1917. Now, he never told us much about these things, almost nothing. He told Keith a little more than the rest of us. And one thing he did tell me, though, is kind of funny. When in the course of doing this, I had to read a lot about submarines, and then I knew after a while when he was a kid he would tell me these things, but I understood nothing about subs, so it didn't mean much to me. But I remember once when I was a kid, I asked him, because I got the idea, it couldn't be all that easy on a submarine. So I said to him, well, weren't you ever sick? And he said, well, after a while I got over it, but the first few weeks, I was sick most of the time. So I said to him, oh no, because I'm thinking, how could you do your job? And he said, well, one day he said, it was really rough seas. It was really choppy, and the thing was just pitching. And the Deutschland, later on, I found out, was kind of, the balance mechanism wasn't the best, and it would tend to roll and pitch at the same time. So he was up in the front because he was signals, and he was staring out into the storm, and he was standing by the helmsman. And all of a sudden he accidentally threw up into the binnacle, which is a big sort of brass thing that holds the magnetic compass and the gauges. And so the helmsman, the officer just gave him a look, and he said, those sort of actions really aren't helpful. That was all he had to say, nothing more that was sufficient, watch where you throw up. But anyway, I see later on that in reports that they said he did very well after the first 3 weeks, and he actually enjoyed it. So yeah, that was, I don't know how, I have no clue how he put up with it when I began to read more things about it. Anyway, after eventually going through a great many adventures, he got to Canada. No, he got home, actually. First he got home. Now, when he got home to Germany, life as he had once known it was just completely gone forever. Germany was forced to accept the sole blame for the war, and the Allies demanded heavy reparation that people could hardly manage to pay. When the troops came home, there was massive unemployment. The Spanish flu epidemic continued. The Allies instituted a blockade of Germany between Armistice Day, November 11th, 1918, and the signing of the peace treaty on June 27th, 1919, to pressure them to sign the peace treaty. And during that time, over 500,000 civilians died from disease or starvation. There was massive hyperinflation in Germany. Because Kaiser Wilhelm suspended the gold standard at the outbreak of the war, and the German parliament had funded the war entirely by borrowing money. Well, they were so sure they would win the war, and with the rich territory they would gain, they thought they could pay back the loans and everything would be just fine. However, when they finally had to start paying reparations, the government resorted to printing money with nothing to back it up. Devaluation of the currency resulted. Even people with money and or a job got into trouble because money doesn't last long under those conditions. Now I think perhaps we can move on to maybe that sort of before, after. Now we're here. He had many more hair-raising adventures and eventually came to Canada in a bit of a rush. So the chapter Life in Canada, as Carl Huss, 1927 to 1967. My father told us very little about life in Germany before he came to Canada in June of 1927. He did not even share the details with my mother. He mentioned serving on a U-boat, and that was fascinating, especially to my older brother Keith. My brother says Dad told him he actually saw Canada before he emigrated here. He told Keith he had visited the east coast of Canada, and that they stopped and killed his sheep as they were running out of fresh meat on board. Apparently the boys left a little note for the farmer that said, "Willie will pay for it." Well, in the end, Willie, which Kaiser Wilhelm certainly did pay for it. Records and court documents show that Dad took his naval training on the old battleship SMS Deutschland and afterwards served on a U-boat. I've included some of the few pictures and postcards that I have of him during his naval training that were given to me by his sister Tony when I saw her in 1979. Dad simply told us he got into serious political trouble after World War I and had to leave Germany abruptly in 1925. Apparently, with the help of his father, he went to Italy, stayed there a couple of years, got into more trouble, and was jailed again in a prison near Rome. Possibly he was using the name Johann Arnold at that time. He used quite a few aliases, and since that was the name of his friendly family doctor in Goisfield, maybe he got the passport from him, who knows. Dad told Keith about a strange incident during the time he was in Italy. He was always pretty cocky, and one day he was sitting in a coffee house with some Italian friends. One of them asked him what he thought of Mussolini. He paused and he coolly said, "Well, I wouldn't mind if he was 6 feet under." Very soon a policeman showed up and he was hauled off to the local station. The cop asked him to take the stuff out of his pocket and he put it all on the table. So he took out his wallet and then he took out a loaded revolver. The cop put his hands up and said, no, don't shoot me." Well, perhaps Tweed's reputation as a trigger man had preceded him. Anyway, Tweed took the gun and laid it on the table facing him and said, "Go ahead, here it is, go ahead and shoot me." Well, they let him go that time, but not the next time when he ended up in jail. His risky and open criticism of Mussolini leads me to believe that he might have already been getting over his taste for right-wing dictatorships. I once saw a couple of pictures of him in a white suit with a pretty girl with high mountains in the background, but those photos are gone now. Keith tells me he said he wanted to marry an Italian woman, but his mother did not approve. Maybe that was her in the photo. Somehow his mother thought he might eventually pursue a career in the diplomatic corps. Well, with his personality and inability to suffer fools gladly, I just can't see it.
He told us he had even visited South America briefly. I remember as a child seeing his passport photo when he came to Canada as Carl Huss, and he was very thin with a pointy little beard. He kept in touch with his parents and sister Tony off and on and sent parcels after World War II when life was again very difficult in Germany. My cousin Ingrid, Tony's daughter, remembers getting those parcels as a small child and enjoying the syrup. Many years later, when I traveled to Germany and met Aunt Tony, she told me how much she missed her older brother and how sorry her mother was never to see him again. He was always nervous about going back and never did return. We urged him to make a trip there in the early 1960s, but by then his health was likely not good enough and he declined. According to Canadian immigration records, he sailed from Cherbourg, France on the SS Mount Erin on June 2, 1927, and arrived in Quebec on June 10, 1927. I just noticed that the ship that he was on used to be called the SS Prince Friedrich Wilhelm and was owned by the Norddeutscher Line. It was caught on a cruise when World War I broke out and sheltered in Oda, Norway throughout the war. Afterward, it was taken by the British and became part of the CP line. I wonder if my father saw it there during the war and decided he'd like to have the ride on that luxury liner years later. Sounds like him, all right. It'd be something he'd do. So, arrival in Winnipeg, June 2nd, 1927. Well, from Quebec, Dad took the train going west on his way to Saskatchewan. He passed through the lovely lakes and rocks of the Canadian Shield, but as he neared Winnipeg, Manitoba, he noticed the trees were thinning out quite a bit. He told us he asked someone what the country was like further west, and they told him, well, after Winnipeg, there's nothing but prairie for 1,000 miles. Well, at that juncture, he decided he didn't want to go to Saskatchewan and got off the train in Winnipeg instead. It's a good thing he did, because I've been to Shaunavon, Saskatchewan, where he was supposed to go, and there's just nothing but miles and miles of fields. He joined the thousands of immigrants at the immigration sheds at the Forks, situated near the junction of the Red and the Assiniboine rivers. I'm including a photo he had taken at that time, exactly at the junction of those two big rivers, on the St. Boniface side, and in it I can see he'd already shaved off the little beard and was smoking as usual. You heard about an offer of cheap land for settlers. The city of Winnipeg, with the cooperation of the Canadian government, would sell them land for very little money. I think it was $10 for a quarter section. If they would agree to live there and develop the land or do logging along the Greater Winnipeg Water District GWWD Railway. He took advantage of that offer and bought land on Northeast 15, Section 2, Township 8, Range 14 East, 6 miles north of Mile 80, and not far from East Braintree, Manitoba, which is about 75 miles east of Winnipeg. It was called the Cooson because the St. Boniface alderman by that name once had a logging company there, supplying wood to the city of the Winnipeg. Mr. Joseph Albert Cooson, 1873 to 1948, also had a lumber company in St. Boniface on Spears Road until 1943. Dad would have taken the GWWD train out to Mile 80 and walked north to the homestead site. The GWWD still had an old spur line going up there that they used to get gravel for the building of the Shoal Lake Aqueduct, so he could have taken a railway handcar or a push car sometimes too. A handcar, for those of you who don't know about the delightful things, was a lightweight railroad car that's powered by the passenger. So a typical design consists of an arm called the walking beam that pivots seesaw-like on a base, which the passengers alternately push down and pull up to move the car. It was lightweight, and it could be removed from the track if another train was approaching. It was damn hard work using a handcar. I mean, I can remember as a kid there being old ones around and trying to. I couldn't. But my mother managed it when she came out, and I included a picture of her on it in 1931. Well, good thing neither of them was fat. He built a log cabin near a rock outcropping on that part of the Cooson where there was old linear and deep water-filled pits that the city of Winnipeg took sand and gravel from when building the railroad and the aqueduct. That particular area is known to locals as a pit. The whole area is now a gravel pit with some jack pine. But when he first came here, most of that area was covered with large trees, spruce and red pine, I think. There's still some enormous stumps. Dad started to log them off and sell the wood. And soon he bought some more land south of there, near the Boggy River on Y Road, owned by a man called John Craig. Mr. Craig operated the sand pit across the river from us until he died, and Jack Wilson took it over. Dad ended up owning one section, which is 640 acres of land. Years later, Dad was forced to sell all but 40 acres of the first piece of land north of the highway at what is known as a Couson, as the government wanted it for a gravel pit. Much gravel would be needed for the building of the Trans-Canada Highway, and so they expropriated most of it from him. In the late 1950s, when the Trans-Canada pipeline went through, they ran a pipe through that land north of the highway, and there is now a caveat on the title as a result. But we all loved the Couson and went swimming in the shallow water-filled pits made when they took gravel from an area near Couson Road. We continue to love it, even though now it's always being logged off so they can dig in new layers of sand and gravel. Just the same, the trees grow back, and many animals, birds, wild berries, fireweed, and even other lovely flowers, including wild orchids, can be found there. We still retain 40 acres of land north of the highway and 15 acres of the original river lot south of the highway. The first few years, Dad spent logging and saving his money. At times he was desperately poor, and Keith remembers him saying how he and his friend Hoover almost starved to death one year. There was a severe drought with no animals around, but finally he shot 2 grouse, and that pulled them through that crisis. The first log cabin he built burned down along with his dog Carlo. He built another larger one as he was thinking of getting married and starting a family. In the winter he cut wood, and in the summers he joined the threshing crews out in western Manitoba, helping the farmers harvesting grain. One summer on one of those trips near Fanistel, Manitoba, he met our mother, Marjorie McNevin, 1907 to 1986, who was a pretty local school teacher. He never said anything to her of his intentions, but saved up money for a ring. When he finally got it all together and went back to ask her to marry him, she'd already married someone else and had a young child, Keith. But he was persuasive. And eventually she left her husband and came out to live on his homestead in 1930 in the log house he'd built there. They had 5 children, Keith from Mom's first marriage, followed by Lloyd, August, Gus, Ida, Irene, Mary, and Doris from their marriage. So, the immigrant is coming along. Now, I thought I might just read one more, a little bit, just a little bit more. Okay, my parents, this is about my parents. They loved to sing and dance when they weren't working, and my dad often played his button accordion. They both loved folk songs and country songs. My brother learned to play the guitar, and we all sang. Tweed, well, that was our nickname for him, liked Red Wing and the Red River Valley, especially. They would enjoy poetry, too, and my dad was especially fond of reciting Robert Service's poems about the Yukon, while Mom liked Tennyson's The Lady of Shalott. They both valued education highly. Both my mother's parents were teachers. Mom was a teacher, and nearly all her siblings followed the same occupation. My dad's father and brother were teachers, so they really had many things in common. When I was about 12, my dad bought me classical records, Beethoven, Strauss, even though they had little money. We had lots of books at home, dictionaries and maps, an encyclopedia, most of the classics, as well as Grimm's and Andersen's fairy tales, and we were allowed to read any of them. I remember with amusement one time when my hyper-religious Aunt Pat, my mother's sister, older sister, brought a number of National Geographic magazines for us. Well, she'd gone to the trouble to put pieces of brown tape all over the naughty beds, the pictures of the bare-breasted ladies, etc. We immediately put on the kettle and had fun all afternoon steaming them off. So, as I mentioned before, we called our father Tweed, a nickname given to him by Keith, who said Dad would whistle or tweet for him when he was outside playing, and it was time for him to come in for meals. And boy, could he ever whistle. He'd stick his fingers in his mouth and tweet. And he could tweet so loud, man, you could just hear him anywhere on the place. And we had 15 acres on the sort of main place there. You could hear him anywhere there, the awful tweet. And you know what I found out, Keith, reading one of those U-boat books by that Messemer guy? They used to tweet for the cat when there was an emergency. They'd whistle like that down the speaking tube right into his room, because that would go penetrate through all the noise. And so no wonder he learned how to whistle so good. Like, who knew, you know? I remember him whistling for me. Boy, if he had to do it twice, I really got into trouble. Anyway, Tweed loved horses and dogs, and we always had lots of both. I remember one year he rescued a young wolf from a trap and kept it in the pen until its leg got better. Then he let it go back. We could hear them howling and calling for it every night. So it was a coyote, I guess. He did some trapping as was usual at that time, and when I was younger, I remember seeing furs of mink and muskrat on stretcher boards drying on the wall. My parents' lives were full of hard work and difficulties, and they never had much money. But that was the life they chose. They were well educated and could have lived in the city, but they both longed to build a life for themselves in a natural setting with their own hands and experience the satisfaction such a life provides. They didn't get electrical service until 1952. Before that, it was all coal oil lamps and wood stoves and carrying up water from the river for laundry. They lost a son in infancy, which continued to cause them pain all their lives. And one of my sisters, Irene, was ill all her life, and they ended up supporting her and her 2 children after her husband died suddenly. They managed to scrape up the money for a few nice cars. The last one was a 98 Olds, especially luxurious. My dad had a serious heart condition at that time and couldn't walk far. So he'd take that car everywhere onto the bush roads and even driving over 4 or 5 foot jack pines if he wanted to see something off to the side. He loved to drive fast, and in the mid-1950s, when he could finally afford a car and before he got sick, he would blast down the highway far faster than the speed limit would allow, often followed by an RCMP officer in hot pursuit. One time I remember Dad came up the driveway fast, came in the house and sat right down at the table, started to work on a crossword puzzle. Not much more than 5 minutes later, a police officer drove into the yard. He knocked at the door and my father yelled, "Come in." The policeman said, "Have you been home long, Carl?" My dad said, "Oh, yes, just about have my supper." The cop said, "Well, it can't have been that too long. I felt the hood of your car on the way in and it's boiling hot," and then he proceeded to write my dad out a speeding ticket. So that was them. That was sort of the way they were. So if any of you have any questions about what I've read here, or if you've had the book for a while and are wondering about, maybe I might know. Probably not, but maybe. But, I figure maybe it's... Well, it was a question of being able to get passports from